What does fantasy say about us as people? The fact that we so readily and so excitedly engage in things that are fantastic, that are not real. In this session, I'm working on a couple of dinosaurs, which we know with some certainty existed on our planet, though we have no real concept of what they looked like. Oh sure, we look at reconstructions, but if you've ever seen the skeleton of a sperm whale or a manatee, you know that the skeleton only tells you so much about what the exterior of a being looks like. If you looked at our skeletons, for example, think of all the funny and abstract things that you could conjure. So they aren't fantastic, or at least they don't belong in fantasy by itself. Things like dragons, wizards, and orcs and elves might fit that category better. But those are common. They are a part of our world, a part of our society, a part of the collective knowledge. Lord of the Rings, when the movies came out, at least in the early 2000s, created a trend towards fantasy that we've really never recovered from. We continue to stay in that territory. But our obsession as a people, as humans, or as the particular culture which we belong in, our fascination with fantasy is an interesting thing. And it's interesting to think about what it says about us. That we're so willing and ready, and in some ways that we ache to get away from our normal, from our mundane, to get into something fantastic. Because that really is what fantasy is, isn't it? It's something outside of our normal where the rules of the universe apply in different ways, where people can conjure things out of their hands or manipulate things that already exist. But all of those pieces and those components are built on the premise that the laws of physics, the universal constants, function differently in this reality. And it says something interesting about us, I think, as humans, that we are so engrossed in those kind of stories. And if you think this is a new trend, look back at some of the most ancient stories that we as humans have ever produced. The Epic of Gilgamesh is arguably the oldest piece of written work that we as humans constructed. And it tells the story rather parallel to the creation story of the Bible, and also the flood that overtook the world, as seen in Genesis in the story of Noah in the Bible. Gilgamesh has components of that, but they're far more fantastic. Gilgamesh is a great king of men who is unrivaled amongst the rest of humankind, and so a creature / man is devised to fight him, and they become friends, and they mess with the gods, and they mess with all kinds of things, and inevitably his friend is killed, and he tries to save him, but he is incapable of doing so. And so he goes off to pursue the Gilgameshian equivalent of Noah, the man who survived the flood and the first man who was granted immortality. Gilgamesh has to chase the sun, as it were. He has to beat the sun to the horizon, if I remember correctly. It's something kind of abstract, and it should be noted here that some of the later portions of the Epic of Gilgamesh have been largely fabricated because we don't actually possess all of the pieces. But that's perhaps the oldest story written down by our human ancestors. If you look at Greek and Roman mythology, or Scandinavian, Chinese, or Japanese mythology, there are always fantastic elements, things that stretch themselves outside of what can actually happen in the confines of reality. And this is just an interesting thing to wrap our heads around. Why is it that we are so excited about these things when our reality is really exciting? There's lots of really cool animals and creatures and things, but have you ever seen a flying lizard that breathes fire? There's something about that, isn't there? Something that just grabs us. And fantasy is beautiful. The idea that we can represent ideas concerning things that don't exist, that we can bring them to life in a way, especially now with video games and movies and TV shows, where we can actually see these things brought to life in a way that is nigh believable. I've thought before how interesting it would be to take a movie from today and show it to somebody from the early 1900s, or even far, far earlier, and see what their thoughts were. Because to them, they would probably assume that what they're seeing is real, right? Because they wouldn't have knowledge of the technology that allows for the fabrication of those elements. So imagine what that might look like, how a person might feel from 1910 watching Star Wars and thinking, this is something that happened, and how did they film this, and how did they do this, and oh my goodness, what does this change about the nature of the universe and our place in it? And I think fantasy does that across the board in some capacity. It helps us to understand more intriguing, nuanced factors of our own reality. And it's a beautiful thing. I, of course, love it. I love fantasy. I love science fiction. I think that there's something beautiful about them. But I think the parts that make them the most interesting is the exaggerated components of our own world. When you think about a dragon, for example, it's very, very different than the eldritch horrors from Lovecraft's work, which are really not believable, and there's some beautiful science fiction fantasy elements in that as well. But dragons are not that. They're giant reptiles, often nowadays represented with only 4 limbs as opposed to being hexapodal like we see in some of the old renditions. So they have the same skeletal structure as things that exist on our planet. We saw this with the redesign of Smaug in the Hobbit movies, which I think was a lovely decision to actually make it much more of a wyvern, a creature that could hypothetically exist, even though it wouldn't, because it would crush itself based on the laws of physics. But a dragon is not that crazy compared to all of the other things that exist on this planet. When we look at the pterosaurs, the largest things that flew on our planet, they are mystically large. They were weird and strange, and if we had seen them, if they still lived today and we could watch them flying around, I'm sure that legends and stories would spring up. Now, I'm not saying that's what happened with dragons, although I would love if that was the case. Wouldn't that be phenomenal to find out that dragons did exist and the stories have just been slowly and slightly exaggerated over the eons? But they're large flying reptiles, and there are flying reptiles in our human history. When you think about giant squid, about krakens and leviathans beneath the surface, well, there are terrifying things beneath the surface of the ocean. I am scared every single time I set foot in any body of water, whether it's just a large lake or the ocean itself, about the prospect of what could potentially be beneath the surface, because I am out of my element. And I think that's a huge part of what fantasy does for us, and science fiction maybe does better, is it places us as the reader, and often humanity as a whole as a character in that story, out of their element. And it's good for us. It's good for us to go to a different place in our minds and to be humbled, to understand that we are not the greatest thing in the universe. We are simply a component of it. Regardless of what you believe religiously, I think you can make a good argument for this from a scientific or a religious standpoint, that we are not the most important thing in the universe. We are a cog, a wheel in this massive, intricate, beautiful, and terrifying thing. And fantasy and science fiction give us the ability to explore that, to see that from a different lens, and I think that's a beautiful thing. So why am I rambling about that as I draw dinosaurs and as I work on a sketchbook session? Well, I think that those elements often tie into artists. It seems rare nowadays to find an artist who only draws, illustrates, paints things that are chiefly real. There's always a push, it seems, especially in younger people who are learning how to make art, to draw and produce things that are fake. Fake's not the right word. Artificial, non-existent, fantastic. There's a lot of ways you can look at it. In fact, some of those words are going to be used derogatorily from adults in your world, maybe even from teachers, if you are so unfortunate. It's the same kind of angst that we see against manga and anime drawing sometimes in schools. But that's the thing, is we can do it, and it's exciting. Like, music could have stayed the same way it always was. We didn't need syncopation or electric guitars or drum sets or anything like that, but we did it because it's fun and because it's cool, and it makes music that's more interesting, at least more diverse than it used to be. And so, yes, if the world only existed with paintings of flowers, landscapes, portraits, and things that do exist, that would be fine. Those are beautiful, and I love looking at them. But you know what else? I love watching movies with dragons and dinosaurs being brought back to life and spaceships. And those things don't exist, and may never exist. But we still get to see them because artists decided that they wanted to bring them into our reality. So it's important, isn't it, for us to draw these fantastic things, to bring them to life, because the rest of the world is only going to see them if artists bring them to life. And it's exciting for us. It's fun, and it's enjoyable. And maybe that is where I should start with all of these conversations, that there is joy to be found in that manner of representation, in that manner of work. And sometimes joy alone is enough. Well, as always, thank you for listening. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your thoughts and your comments down below. If you want to support the channel, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. And if you are interested in joining a small, blossoming art community associated with this channel, there's a Discord link in the description too. This community is being built at the moment specifically to give refuge to artists, a place where they can talk, rant, vent, and just be their weird artistic selves. In addition, there's a couple channels in there specifically for critique, for getting feedback on your work, and others that are safe to just show off what you're working on and what you're happy with. The community aspect is important for us as artists, so I would encourage you, if you have any interest, check out the Discord. It's a lovely place to spend time. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.